All right, hey, how's it going, everybody? We're going to do some lecture today on policy analyses. We're going to finish up that section of the course. So it should be relatively short, but I want to cover the other two types of policy analyses that we're going to talk about for this class. So let me just share my screen with you. All right. Okay, so it'll take a second to share or slideshow. All right, so last lecture we talked about economic analyses. Today we're going to talk about political and institutional analysis and ethical analysis. So really, let me just, I have trouble with this screen here. So with political analysis and institutional analysis, what we're really focused on here, whereas with economic analysis, we're really thinking about efficiency, right, and the benefits versus the cost of policy action. With political and institutional analysis, we're thinking about one, the likelihood of policy adoption. So we're thinking about the political climate, okay? We have a potential policy solution. So remember, that's kind of where we're at is we've identified a problem. We've identified some potential policy solutions to that problem. We've established some evaluative criteria, okay? Such as effectiveness, efficiency, political feasibility, and then we'll talk about the ethical aspect. But here we're kind of focused on that political feasibility component. And so now we're thinking about, well, how do we compare, how do we analyze a policy instrument based on its political and institutional characteristics in terms of, you know, how it compares to other policy options we might have, right? So with here, and in terms of evaluating political feasibility, using political and institutional approaches or analyses, we're thinking about the likelihood of policy adoption and the effectiveness of policy action from an implementation kind of perspective. So a lot of times when you're doing these types of analyses, you're applying qualitative or mixed methods approaches, which just means qualitative means you might be reading documents rather than looking at quantitative data like numbers, right? With qualitative data, we're thinking about, you know, words, interviews with people. You might look at political party, you know, polarization, and things like this. Rather than just looking at numbers, you might be looking more at like qualitative information, such as like interviews or reviewing documents and things like this. And you might combine qualitative with quantitative, so using mixed methods approaches, right? So you might combine the two. And so we use these types of approaches, again, to think about things like political feasibility, implementation, and then to evaluate programs in terms of how they've done once they've actually been implemented, right? So you can, again, you can apply policy analysis to various aspects of the policy process, right? So a lot of times we apply policy analysis at the policy formulation stage of the policy process. But here with program evaluation, you're talking about you've already selected a policy instrument and you've implemented it, and now you want to evaluate how it's doing, right? So remember, we can apply policy analysis to any stage of the policy making process, and it can provide useful information. So with political feasibility analysis, essentially what we're doing is we're thinking about or trying to answer the question of, you know, how likely is this to be adopted, this policy option going, what's the likelihood of this policy instrument being adopted given the political climate? So we want to know the extent to which elected officials, other policy actors support a particular policy option or alternative, right? And so when you do this type of analysis, you can identify the formal and informal policy actors. So remember, in terms of formal policy actors, what we're talking about there are like elected officials, people who write laws in the legislative branch, maybe even the judicial branch and executive branch. You're looking at these individuals, particularly oftentimes from a political party affiliation can be informative, but you could also look at past voting records and how they voted on similar policy tools to address similar policy problems. I'm sorry, there's a horn going on in the background. I don't know if that's bothering you, but I'm picking up on it. Informal policy actors are more like interest groups, right? So you have the special interest groups which have a direct economic interest in a particular policy issue. And then you have public interest groups, which are more interested in kind of the general public's well-being, right? So you can also look at how they view a particular policy tool, whether or not they're likely to support that policy tool to address a particular problem. Because remember, these are interest groups that have membership and they have political power. They represent various interests in society. And so they're consistently weighing in on policy issues that relate to their interests and providing policymakers, formal policy actors, with information to help them achieve their interests, right? And so again, in terms of formal policy actors, you could be looking at the state level. Maybe you're looking at members of city council, members of Congress. You could also be looking at administrative officials, so people that work in the executive branch for executive branch agencies. And again, you're also looking at major interest groups to see maybe how they view a particular tool to address a particular problem. And so once you've identified those individuals, you wanted to determine their position, right? So as I already mentioned, you investigate their stances on a particular issue. You could think about party affiliation or their general political attitudes about, the role of government in addressing public problems. What have they done in past related issues? How have they weighed in on these issues? So again, this is not necessarily quantitative data, right? We're not necessarily looking at numbers. You might just review voting habits, review reports on similar problems to see, again, where do they stand? And so you're kind of maybe reading through documents rather than looking at numbers and kind of gauging their overall opinion and trying to predict the likelihood that they will support a new tool to address an existing problem given their past record, right? And so in all of this, the ultimate goal is to estimate their level of interest in this issue using this policy tool, estimate the intensity of their views, how strong, how intense are their views, is there a likelihood that those views can be changed, right? So if you think they're going to be opposed to a particular policy tool, how intense is their opposition? If we give them more information about the problem or the effectiveness of this tool, might we be able to change their opposition and get them to be supportive? And how motivated are they to get involved, right? If you're talking about special interests, groups that have a direct economic interest in a particular problem and a tool that might, have a negative effect on them, if a policy tool is going to have a direct economic impact that's a negative to a particular industry, you can imagine that their motivation to oppose that policy tool would be quite strong. And so again, all of this information goes in and we try to evaluate, what is the political feasibility? What's the likelihood that this tool can get passed given what we know about the political climate from elected officials, the positions and views of special and public interest groups, right? This is all important to know when we're weighing a particular policy option, because you don't want to invest all of your resources into a particular policy tool that might be really good and very effective, but has very low political feasibility. Well, if we propose it, it's definitely not going to pass, right? The ultimate goal is to address problems. And so you have to think about, well, we have these potential tools to address this particular problem. What's the likelihood of each one getting passed? And so, one might be very effective at dealing with a problem, but it might have very low political feasibility. And you ought to take that into account. Whereas another tool might be less effective, but have higher political feasibility. And so, once we get it passed, maybe we can start to address the problem and maybe down the road we modify it, right? And so these are things that have to go into the decision-making process to consider these things, right? If we think about media coverage, this is also important too, because it sways public opinion on certain issues. And so, again, all of these factors, the formal, informal policy actors come into play in terms of thinking about political feasibility analysis. And I didn't mention this, But the general public, of course, is a strong informal policy actor, and they form political feasibility. They inform political feasibility largely through public opinion, and this is influenced oftentimes by things like the media, but also interest groups and, of course, elected officials' statements about particular problems. So that's political feasibility analysis. That's all I really wanted to say there. In terms of implementation analysis, as I mentioned, if we go back to the policy making model that we used up to the midterm that we looked at, this is a general procedural model of the policymaking process where something gets put on the agenda. We formulate policy tools to address the problem. We legitimate it by getting it adopted by the legislation, and then it gets kicked over to the executive branch, typically agencies who then implement, right? And so this is where we can apply policy analysis to analyze and evaluate implementation of actual policy tools. So we're not so much focused on the policy formulation stage here in terms of policy analysis, but we're focused on implementation, right? And implementation is one of the most important steps. Typically, again, it comes after we've written a law. Policies have to be put into action, right? So typically once a policy becomes a law, once it's been legitimized and passed by the legislature, it gets kicked to a department or agency who has oversight over that particular area of public policy, right? So it could be education, it could be health, it could be environment, right? And so if the law or the policy falls within one of those three categories, it goes to one of those three kind of executive branch agencies to be implemented. And so executive branch agencies, and I mentioned this in class before we went online, but the laws that are written, a lot of times laws as they're written can be very general, right? Establish goals, establish guidelines for what the government wants to be achieved to address a public problem, but it's less heavy on the details, right? So what happens is once the law is passed, it gets kicked to an agency, and the agency has to make those detailed decisions, right? So the agency has to interpret what the policy is calling for, so they establish this particular goal. So once the agency kind of sets, okay, we have this goal in mind, we want to achieve this outcome, then the agency has to adopt formal rules or regulations or guidelines to help achieve those goals. So the agency really kind of sets out or establishes the details for addressing a particular problem once a law has been passed. And they use resources, right? So each agency has people that work for them. They have staff, they have money and resources allocated to actually implement the program to carry out the policy once all the details have been kind of hashed out. And sometimes this process of implementation is relatively smooth and straightforward, but sometimes it's not, and it's kind of a rocky road, right? And this, is usually directly related to the complexity of the issue that's trying to be addressed. Right now, there's, some challenges with the coronavirus if we think about testing, right? So everybody agrees at the government level that we need more testing. The question is, how do we implement the testing? How do we get the equipment? Where is it going to come from? Right, and in some places this has been more challenging than others. The federal government has kind of allowed the states, for better or for worse, to kind of take on this task. And so, you see some variation in how states are responding and able to address the issue of testing for the coronavirus. And so it's not necessarily a smooth process because it's a new issue that's being dealt with. A new challenge that there's not a lot of record to look back at how have we done this in the past. And so, again, the complexity of the problem as well as experience in dealing with that particular problem weighs in on whether or not the process is smooth or kind of a bumpy road into implementation, right? One example of implementation that's just really simple and is covered in the text is if you look at the Affordable Care Act, right? So this is the Obamacare legislation that was passed under President Obama. essentially providing healthcare for requiring that everyone be covered and be provided with healthcare coverage. And once that act was passed, and we're dealing with this now actually too. But in the example of the Affordable Care Act, the federal government rushed to set up its webpage for online enrollment, right? So if we're going to make healthcare available for all, it makes sense from an efficiency perspective to have an online presence, a website where people can enroll into the healthcare program. But this program was designed in a way that it wasn't really, it didn't have the capacity to deal with the amount of online or internet traffic, right? And so the government essentially kind of contracted out this service to a private company. The private company, they again, I'm not saying this is the wrong way to go, but this is what the government did. And private companies have an economic incentive to be to be profitable, and so they want to perform a task as quickly as possible at the lowest cost. And that may have had implications for how this website was designed, because ultimately it was decided that it wasn't tested efficiently or sufficiently, again, to understand what's the capacity of this website before it went live. And so essentially, and the contract that the government had with the private company, it really didn't establish clear lines of oversight. Like, we want you to design this website, and we want you to make sure that it can handle the amount of traffic we think it's going to have, right? So the company gets this contract to design this website. They put it together because they want to do it quickly and make profit and do it at a low cost, and they want to get the product done. But they didn't necessarily do enough examination of the website's functionality before it went live to the public, right? So looking back, we can analyze this implementation process, because ultimately what happened was the website got too much traffic in it and it failed. The website actually crashed. And so from an implementation analysis perspective, we can look at, why did the website crash? And those types of analyses have identified these types of challenges or reasons why, the website just wasn't designed for that amount of traffic. And here's maybe what caused that to happen. And, in terms of unemployment enrollment with the coronavirus, especially in New York, initially there were a lot of reports that as these unemployment sites were getting heavily trafficked as people were laid off or fired from their jobs, that there was some issues with the internet, these websites, because again, we can look back and think about, well, when these websites were implemented to provide these services, were they designed to handle this amount of traffic, right? And so we can look back and analyze why these types of failures or kind of bumps in the road happen. And this allows policymakers to respond to those implementation successes or implementation failures, right? At the end of the day, it allows us to learn from our mistakes and maybe not make them again in the future, right? So when we do implementation analysis, the goal really is, again, to inform the design of policy, to think about, implementation successes, document successes and failures. And again, a lot of it is to inform or provide learning experiences for the implementing agency and maybe other agencies who have similar programs. In this process, we want to think about, again, the difficulty of the problem being addressed, right? Because implementation challenges, one of the key factors that influences the success of implementation is the complexity of the issue, right? Is a very simple and straightforward program, or does the program have a lot of moving parts? And so implementation is going to be kind of this clunky thing until we get some more experience working with it. And how sound and clear was the initial policy that was written, right? Was a policy written by the legislative branch that was kind of just really too vague? And so implementing agencies had to really kind of figure out what they were trying to accomplish, and therefore design kind of vague policy approaches or implementation practices to address the problem. And again, we have to think about, was the policy designed, so when we do implementation analysis, if we find failures, it doesn't necessarily just fall on the agency. We might have to go back and look at the actual law itself and understand, like, was the agency misinterpreting the law and how they designed this program, or was the law kind of off base with how it was trying to address the particular problem? You also have to look at, like, kind of political aspects. Was the administration not that interested in making sure this program rolled out in a way that was effective for the public? Are there economic implications at play? Is the agency underfunded? Do they not have enough resources to support the program? Are there institutional factors like, a problem requires multiple agencies to collaborate together, but they're just not working together effectively. And so there's clunky issues with implementation due to the lack of collaboration across agencies, right? And again, a lot of this gets back to the complexity of the issue. A lot of it also gets into, if we think about the political aspects of a problem. Um, with the Trump administration, one of the concerns has been relaxing rule enforcement of like environmental laws, right? So we have these laws, but the laws have to be implemented. And so if it's not a political priority for a particular president to address a particular set of problems, even though there's laws on the books, they might reduce resources, reduce the economic resources of an agency. They might relax enforcement. And so all of these things can have political economic implications or components, right? And so again, we have to think about these things when we do implementation analysis. Program evaluation is kind of, again, after implementation. So this is a different stage of the policymaking process that we can apply policy analysis to. It's, again, goes hand in hand. So you can see here, it's almost that last stage of the policymaking process model. You have, again, agenda setting, policy formulation, legitimation, implementation. And then once something's been implemented, we want to evaluate from an analytical perspective the outcome of a particular policy after it's been implemented. So this goes hand in hand with implementation. Because we want to monitor long-term successes or failures, right? So, just as an example, if we're thinking about like immigration policy, especially in the last few years, but historically the U.S., has had various series of immigration policies at the national level. How well are these policies doing in terms of limiting illegal immigration, right? So, when we think about changes in laws, modification of existing laws or brand new laws, we always want to track, gather information on the outcomes to see, again, was this the right path to go? Was this the right approach to take? Did this actual approach to addressing, a particular public issue achieve the desired outcomes? Could the outcomes have been achieved in a different way, in a more low cost way? All of these aspects we can think about in terms of actually evaluating actual outcomes, right? And so again, like policy analysis can be very useful for thinking about program evaluation and comparing the outcomes of different policy approaches to addressing a particular problem. With the Affordable Care Act, the obvious question is, did we see improved access to healthcare services? There's this, and again, this is all pulled from the text, but there was this program, I don't know if any of you are familiar with it, but drug abuse resistance education, this DARE program that was designed to essentially expose children, school-age kids to the dangers of drug use. This is one policy approach to like reduce chemical dependencies in society, reduce cases of drug addiction and abuse. But the government is allocating money, right, to these types of programs to put these programs in schools so that children are exposed to these programs and learn about the dangers of substance abuse. And so again, if we're allocating money, public money, we need to think about, well, how effective is this program at addressing a particular problem? And so the program was evaluated, and this particular program was revealed that, because this was a really nationally popular program to address issues of substance abuse, that ultimately was not really that effective at addressing substance abuse. That, children who were exposed to the DARE program were not necessarily less likely, perhaps, on average, to use drugs down the road. And so the U.S. Department of Education ultimately pulled funds from this program because, again, it's an opportunity cost. If we're investing money in a particular program to achieve a desired outcome, and that outcome is not being achieved, well, maybe we should pull back that money and invest it somewhere else where maybe we can achieve a more effective outcome to address that particular problem. And so this is, again, why program evaluation is important. The last thing I want to talk about is ethical analysis. So this is basically a systematic evaluation or examination of kind of ethical or normative issues in public policy. And remember, when we talk about ethics or norms, we're talking about like what is the desired state of being? Like what do we want to exist? What do we believe ought to exist in society, right? And so again, this is often ethical considerations are left up to be considered or addressed by advocacy communities, thinking about what do interests want, what are interest groups pushing for, right? Because interest groups, public opinion, these are important informational tools for policymakers in terms of what do people want society to look like, right? What's the desired goal in terms of quality of life in the world, right? And so, you know, from thinking about an ethical perspective, sometimes, and I mentioned this in the previous lecture, we might think about, if we're thinking about normative aspects of society, what should society look like? We might lessen the importance or significance of objective aspects of society, right? Like, well, what does exist, right? And so we have to kind of balance these things. Some examples of ethical analysis, and again, we're thinking about like equality issues, rights to freedom, things like this, right? Which again, in some ways can be debatable, right? What's unequal treatment? In some cases, you know, what's an infringement on my personal freedoms, right? Some people debate these things. Whereas if we're looking at clear numbers, numbers aren't necessarily debatable, um, uh, but understanding of like what are you entitled to, what should be provided to you as a citizen and individual living in this society, etc. This can be debatable, a normative type of discussion, right? And so if we look at like the terrorist attacks of September 11th, in response to that, there was a federal law that was established that required random searches of individuals and carry-on luggage. At the time that this law was passed, right, federal officials were concerned that that, you know, random searches might turn into profiling, right? Where essentially people were selected for random searches based on their demographic characteristics, right? Appearances, and things like this. And this lack of randomness to searching for people that are traveling on airplanes would basically be a violation of civil rights, civil liberties, right? And so again, you know, many people, particularly like civil libertarians, argued that, you know, racial, ethnic profiling as a result of this law should be unacceptable, and it's particularly in a society that values diversity, right? So while this law on face value in response to the terrorist attacks looks like it could be effective, right? The question is it ethical? Does it have a disproportionate impact on certain members of society based on their racial, ethnic backgrounds, right? And ultimately, and many experts weighed in on this and basically found that you know, the random search approach might not be even that effective at addressing the concerns that it was established to address, such as like plane hijacking or instances of terrorism on airplanes. And so again, if you're doing random searches, you're slowing down people's mode of travel. You might be profiling people, which is arguably a violation of civil liberties. And then ultimately, is it even effective at achieving the desired outcome, right? So there were also questions about this. What happened, you know, again, is that we saw a lot of profiling, or there have been cases of profiling documented. And ultimately, from an ethical perspective, we think about, well, does profiling people, you know, does the profiling aspect of airline security violate civil liberties, right? And again, is profiling justifiable use of government authority in order to, you know, in the argument or in the name of protecting the country? Ultimately, what happened after this program had been rolled out and implemented and evaluated from an ethical perspective, the Obama administration basically announced formal restrictions on racial profiling. And so, you know, some officers and Department of Homeland Security agents continued to use some forms of profiling, particularly when using passengers and guarding the border in the Southwest, right? So a lot of times we think about this as a Middle East problem on the East Coast, but on the West Coast, right, you're thinking about the Southwest border and profiling that occurs there. And so again, that, ethical questions, we don't want to lose sight of the objective aspects of policy analysis, but ethical questions of equity, rights and freedoms, liberties certainly have an important role in policy analysis as well. So the last things I want to say, a policy analysis is kind of this craft and art, right? The craft is like knowing the different methods of analysis. We have kind of, we covered uh, economic analyses, political feasibility, institutional, ethical analyses. And we gave a brief overview of each of these things. You can dive deeper into these methodological approaches, but you really want to know these methods from an analysis perspective, when you should use one approach versus another, and understand kind of the technical nuances of each approach. That's the craft, right? You want to develop a skill set that allows you to apply these analyses and allows you to produce kind of credible, reliable results, and for that matter, objective. The art is kind of the creative aspect of policy analysis and really selecting criteria for different assessments, right? How do we want to analyze this? We want to apply the economic tools, but how do we value things that don't have market value, right? There's some creative element to this where we have to be creative and at the same time rigorous in how we perform policy analyses. We want to also recognize that analyses have various limitations, particularly with respect to data collection and availability. And again, we always want to essentially think about this when we report conclusions, right? So what kind of analysis did we apply? Why did we apply it? How did we apply it? Here's the limitations of the whole thing. But this is what we find given what we applied, economic analysis, given how we applied it and the data we collected and the data we couldn't collect. This is what we're concluding, given all of those things, right? And so ultimately, there's an art and a craft associated with policy analysis. So that's all for today. What I'm going to do is I'm probably going to post a discussion board about some of the content we've talked about in the next day or so to get you thinking about applying this stuff to, in particular, coronavirus. But I'll post announcements about that. In the meantime, please stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you all soon. All right.